There's an old story about a young man so striking that everyone who saw him fell in love on sight. Shepherds, nymphs, strangers passing on the road. He turned every one of them away, untouched, almost bored by their devotion. Then one afternoon, kneeling at the edge of a still forest pool to drink, he saw a face looking back up at him from the water, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't look away. He didn't know what he was looking at. He thought it was someone else. Someone finally worth wanting. He stayed at the edge of that pool until he died there, unable to leave a face that could never leave him back. We've turned his name into a diagnosis. But the detail everyone remembers about the myth is the reflection. The detail almost everyone forgets is what he was actually looking for in it. He wasn't in love with his own face. He didn't know it was his own face. He was in love, for the first and only time, with the sensation of being looked at by something that never looked away. That isn't vanity. That might be the loneliest moment in all of Greek mythology. And it might be the closest thing we have to an accurate map of what's actually happening inside a narcissist's mind. Ask most people to describe one, and they'll reach for the same handful of words: arrogant, self-obsessed, in love with their own reflection, convinced of their own superiority. Picture the coworker who turns every meeting into a monologue, or the parent who needs to be praised for parenting. The cultural image is someone overflowing with confidence, too much self-esteem rather than too little. The proposed remedy follows the same logic. Humble them. Call out the ego. Refuse to feed it. If the problem is excess self-regard, the fix is simply less of it. Picture the version everyone recognizes. The boss who redirects every team's success back to a decision he made, who fills silences in meetings with his own opinions restated as fact, who can recall in exact detail every compliment he's ever received and almost none of the help he's ever gotten. He looks, from across the table, like a man who thinks entirely too much of himself. Nobody in that meeting can see what's happening at 2 in the morning, when a single unanswered email from someone senior keeps him awake, rewriting it in his head, certain it means something is already going wrong. This picture isn't entirely wrong, but it mistakes a symptom for a cause, the way mistaking a fever for the infection causing it. Clinicians who have spent careers studying narcissistic personality patterns keep arriving at something almost opposite to the popular image. The grandiosity isn't the disorder. It's the scaffolding built around a much older, much more fragile structure underneath, a structure that, left unsupported, cannot stand on its own at all. Which raises the real question. If the confidence is scaffolding, what is it actually holding up? It was Sigmund Freud who first borrowed the myth's name for a clinical concept in the early years of the 20th century, though it would take several more decades of theory before anyone could say precisely what they were looking at. In the middle of the century, a psychoanalyst named Heinz Kohut proposed something that quietly reorganized the whole picture. Kohut argued that every developing self needs, at a very early age, something specific from the people raising it: accurate mirroring. A caregiver's genuine delight at being looked at, admired, reflected back with warmth, again and again, until a child develops a stable internal sense that they are worth attending to, independent of whether anyone happens to be attending to them at that moment. When that mirroring is inconsistent, conditional, or simply absent, when a child is only ever noticed for performing, achieving, or behaving in specific approved ways, something in that internal structure never finishes forming. The self stays, in a sense, permanently unfinished, permanently dependent on the outside world to complete a job it should have been able to do on its own. Kohut had a term for the people we lean on to perform functions our own psychology can't yet perform for itself: self-objects. For most adults, other people are experienced as fully separate, with their own histories, their own inner weather, their own right to disagree or look away. For someone whose early mirroring failed, other people can remain, on some structural level, self-objects for life. Not fully separate individuals, but extensions whose entire function is to reflect admiration back, the way that pool reflected a face. This is why relationships with narcissistic people so often feel less like being known and more like being used as an instrument, a mirror, an audience. It frequently isn't cruelty in the way cruelty is usually meant. It's closer to a perceptual limitation, a mind that structurally cannot yet process another person as fully real. A few years later, the pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott described a related pattern from a different angle. Winnicott noticed that children raised in environments that couldn't tolerate their spontaneous, authentic reactions, environments that were intrusive, inconsistent, or that only responded warmly to a compliant, impressive, easy version of the child, would often build what he called a false self. A performing, image-managing self, constructed specifically to keep the people around it satisfied, while the true self, the spontaneous, unpolished, sometimes inconvenient one, gets tucked further and further out of view. Carl Jung, writing decades earlier, had already described something similar in the concept of the persona, a word borrowed from the Latin for the masks actors wore in Roman theater, a device built specifically to project a face larger and more legible than the actor's own. The persona was useful right up until it got mistaken for the face underneath. Sometimes the false self goes so far out of view that the person carrying it loses conscious access to what's underneath. All that's left is the performance, and the performance has to be maintained constantly, because underneath it isn't a rival self waiting to emerge. Underneath it is uncertainty about whether there's anyone there at all. This is also why the popular image of the narcissist, loud, dominant, impossible to miss, only captures half the picture. Clinicians distinguish two faces of the same underlying structure. The grandiose face is the familiar one, expansive, entitled, magnetic, quick to claim credit, and slow to accept blame. The vulnerable face looks almost like its opposite, quiet, self-effacing, hypersensitive to any hint of criticism, prone to sudden withdrawal when they sense they haven't been sufficiently admired. Different costumes, same underlying architecture. Both are built around a self that cannot regulate its own sense of worth internally, and both depend, to an almost involuntary degree, on a continuous supply of attention from outside to feel real. Clinicians sometimes have a specific term for the fuel both faces are chasing: narcissistic supply, a steady stream of attention, admiration, or even conflict that a fragile structure needs constantly, because unlike a secure sense of self, it can never be stored for later. It's worth being precise about scale here. Only a small fraction of people who show traits like these would ever meet the clinical threshold for a diagnosable personality disorder. Most people carrying this structure never receive a formal diagnosis at all. They simply move through families, workplaces, and relationships causing a specific, recognizable kind of damage, while the people closest to them spend years trying to name what's actually happening. The clinical label matters less here than the underlying mechanism, because the mechanism is what actually explains the experience of living near it. This dependency explains something else researchers have documented closely: why even a small, offhand criticism can trigger a wildly disproportionate reaction, sudden rage, cold withdrawal, an urgent need to diminish whoever delivered the blow. Psychologists studying the link between self-esteem and aggression found that the danger wasn't high self-esteem itself. It was self-esteem that was high but unstable, a sense of worth so dependent on continuous external validation that even a minor puncture registers, internally, less like an insult and more like an emergency. Not someone defending an ego that's too big. Someone defending a structure with no foundation underneath it, using the only tools available: force, withdrawal, or the sudden, total devaluation of whoever just proved, if only for a second, that the mirror could crack. None of this describes an alien species of person separate from the rest of us. It describes an extreme point on a line every human being stands somewhere along. Almost everyone maintains some gap between the self they show and the self they privately are. Almost everyone, on a bad enough day, has used another person briefly as an audience rather than truly listened to them, needed to be admired more than known, flinched harder at criticism than the criticism actually warranted. Whole platforms now exist to let this instinct run in public, a curated grid of a life, a highlight reel standing in for a self, an audience of strangers whose only function is to press a small button that means I saw you. This isn't a new appetite, only a new machine for feeding it. Long before feeds and follower counts, Entire courts existed to reflect a monarch's magnificence back at him in gilt and oil paint, portrait after portrait commissioned specifically to confirm what he already needed to believe about himself. The technology changes. The hunger underneath it is considerably older. The difference between an ordinary human ego and a narcissistic structure isn't the presence of this mechanism. It's the degree to which a person's entire sense of being real depends on it running constantly, with no working alternative underneath. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes the question most people actually want answered. It was never really why are some people like this. It's closer to how much of my own need to be seen is actually a need to be known, and how much of it is a need for a mirror that behaves, one that reflects back only the version of me I can bear to look at. There's a cost to living inside that second kind of need that rarely gets discussed, because it looks, from the outside, like the opposite of suffering. Picture someone who just delivered a flawless presentation, praised by everyone in the room, replaying it that night, still hungry, still waiting for a compliment that hasn't landed yet, still unable to let the good version of the evening settle into something they simply get to keep. The praise arrives and evaporates almost on contact, because it was never being absorbed by a self stable enough to hold it. It was only ever passing through, briefly quieting an ache that returns the moment the room empties. Children raised inside this structure often absorb a specific, invisible lesson long before they have language for it. That love is a performance review, granted for achievement and withdrawn for ordinariness. Some grow up avoiding attention altogether, having learned early that being noticed is dangerous. Others grow up building the very same scaffolding themselves, having learned, just as early, that scaffolding is the only shape a self is allowed to take. Neither outcome is a character flaw. Both are simply what a nervous system does when it's raised to believe that being ordinary is unsafe. There's a second character in the myth, one far less remembered than the boy at the pool. Her name was Echo, and she loved him first. A curse had already taken her own voice from her. She could only repeat back whatever words were spoken to her, never originate a sentence of her own. When she finally found the courage to approach him, all she could do was echo his own words back, unable to say a single thing that hadn't come from him first. He turned her away, the way he turned everyone away, and she withdrew into a cave, wasting slowly, until nothing remained of her but a voice that still, to this day, only ever repeats what it's given. Anyone who has loved someone with this structure will recognize her before they recognize him. The exhausting sensation of only ever being permitted to reflect, never to originate. Of watching your own needs, your own opinions, your own separate existence, slowly edited out of the relationship until what's left of you is an echo of what they wanted to hear. This isn't a flaw in how much you love them. It's what happens, structurally, when you try to build a relationship with someone whose internal architecture can only process a mirror, never another whole person standing across from them. Understanding where the structure came from doesn't erase what it costs the people standing near it. Compassion for the wound and honesty about the damage aren't opposites. They can, and often need to, exist in the same sentence. Go back to the pool. In most versions of the story, there's a moment before the end where he finally understands what he's looking at. He reaches into the water to embrace the face he's fallen in love with, and the instant his hand breaks the surface, the reflection scatters into ripples and disappears. He can look at it. He can long for it. He can waste his entire remaining life at the edge of it. He can never once actually hold it, because it was never a separate being capable of being held. It was only ever himself, staring back. This is the part the popular use of his name leaves out entirely. Narcissus isn't a symbol of excessive self-love. He's a symbol of a very specific, very old kind of loneliness, the loneliness of a person who can be looked at constantly, admired relentlessly, surrounded at every moment, and still never once actually be touched by another consciousness meeting his, because he built, without meaning to, a world where only his own reflection was allowed to exist in the room with him. All that was left where he finally died was a flower bent toward the water, the same flower that still carries his name and still grows, to this day, forever bowed over a surface it can never actually reach. Somewhere tonight, Someone is performing a version of themselves for an audience they can't actually let get close, terrified, underneath the performance, that there might be nothing there if the mirror ever stopped. And somewhere near them, someone else is quietly wasting into an echo, offering pieces of themselves that only ever get handed back unchanged. The question worth sitting with isn't whether you know a narcissist. It's this: in your own life, in your own relationships, when was the last time you let another person see something in you that wasn't curated for them first? And when was the last time you actually saw someone else clearly enough to let them be someone other than a reflection of what you needed them to be?